Welcome back to For All the Saints, and I've got another special guest with me today, so it's not just my voice. We've got Rhys Laverty with us as well. Rhys is an old friend of Exeter. Rhys, tell us about your connection with us here at St Leonard's, and I suppose by extension at All Saints.
Yes, good to be with you, Paul, and nice to be doing something with or for St Leonard's, or I guess plants to be from St Leonard's, or particularly. Yeah, I was at St Leonard's as an undergraduate from 2011 to 2014, so 10 years now, this summer since I left. And my now wife, Libby, she was ministry assistant for 2 more years after that, and we've been back to Exeter several times since then. I spoke on the student getaway a couple of years ago at Hill House, and yeah, very fond memories of my time as a student at St Leonard's, and glad to still have some ongoing friendships from then. And then it was great when I stumbled across this guy, Paul Sutton, saying, intelligent, learned theological things on the internet, and I was like, oh, where's he based? And of course he's at St Leonard's.
Of course.
So people like that end up.
And Rhys, it is particularly fun for me to be talking to you because we have actually met once in person, but we are basically internet friends, and it makes me feel very young.
Yeah, I say that. I think actually maybe we did meet in person first, actually, and then
yeah. I think that's probably right.
That's true. Yeah, it was at an Oak Hill summer study day a few years ago. Yeah.
So tell us what you're up to now. No longer in Exeter, but back in London area.
Yep. So I live in Chesington, which is where I grew up, which is the very southern fringe of Zone 6 in South London, edge of London and Surrey. And I work for an organisation called the Davenant Institute, which is based in the US, but I work remotely from home. My short way of putting it is we do nerdy church history stuff. The longer phrase is we retrieve the riches of classical Protestantism to renew and build up the contemporary church. So we publish books, old books, things that were around at the time of the Reformation. We might modernize them or put them out in new editions, lots of kind of primary source stuff. We run a journal called Ad Fontes, which I'm the editor of, where kind of shorter form content that sort of puts the kind of theological stuff we're interested in into practice. And we have an educational wing called Davenant Hall, which runs online classes and degree programs. And I'm actually also part-time enrolled in our master's program, which is lots of church history, theology, primary source, stuff like that. Yeah, and that takes up my time.
So if people are listening are interested in nerdy church history retrieval stuff, then Rhys is your man. He can hook you up with the nerdiest and best. And you also have a Substack, is that right? Which kind of
yes. I write a Substack, which, if you know what a Substack is, it's kind of like a blog, but it comes directly into your email inbox.
It's a blog, but cooler. That's what it is.
Cooler, kind of like a newsletter. And psychologically, for some reason, people are more likely to read an email burning a hole in their pocket than they are to follow a link to a blog. So I write a Substack called The New Albion, where I try and give Christian commentary for a changed Britain. Fill what I saw as a bit of a gap in the market of kind of commentary on current and cultural affairs, is often both in Christian and non-Christian spaces dominated by American politics and American cultural and social problems, but a British voice, and certainly a British evangelical voice, is often sort of missing in there. So trying to do a bit of that, so you can find that. Just Google The New Albion, Rhys Laverty, and you'll find it.
Cool. Now, the reason I wanted to talk to you was specifically to fit into this series on children that we're doing. So just to recap in the briefest way, we've spoken about children in the image of God. We've spoken about how they're fallen in Adam, condemned and guilty, therefore in need of salvation, and that God has promised that salvation, that they are within the promises of God. I wanted to sort of try and join the dots from that to baptism now by talking about children and baptism. And the particular reason it's great to talk to Rhys about this is, like me, Rhys grown up in a Baptistic sort of background, but it's only the last few years that you've moved from a clearly Baptistic, only professing grown-up people should be baptized to children should be baptized. Can you just tell us the story of that? How did that happen?
Yeah, well, as you say, I grew up in a Baptistic environment here at Chesington Evangelical Church, or now King's Church Chesington, a Baptistic church. Never one that was aggressively Baptistic. We actually, I now know, had members who were baptized as infants, elders who held infant baptism, but it was our practice Baptistic. And then I never really encountered evangelical pedo-Baptists, and it was just something I associated with very nominal belief. I have a very nominal Roman Catholic Irish family on my dad's side. So it was actually only coming to St Leonard's where I first began to meet evangelical Peter Baptists, and it was began to then have some friendly arguments and robust conversations with people I met there. Among them, Chris Keane. Probably one of the first times I ever knew there was such a thing as the 39 Articles was Chris making the odd mention of them when the question of baptism came up, and another friend, Becca Wells, who is formerly of that parish, from a Presbyterian background, trying to make the case for me. But I was young and shooting from the hip and very unpersuaded by the Peter Baptist arguments at that point. I think when you're an undergrad going to a church like St Leonard's, they don't want to make you an Anglican. They just want to help you to follow Jesus for 3 years. So then I worked at Anglican Church as a ministry apprentice at All Souls Anglican Place. Again, not a sort of great drive to turn you into an Anglican while you were there. But it was at that stage I began to develop more of an interest in church history. And then kind of fast forward to that, ended up going to Bible College at Union in Wales. So I was remotely based here in Chesington. And it was then, as that interest in church history grew, beginning to realise that being a Baptist is really the minority report in church history. Now, that isn't to say that there were not people who were Baptists in what we call the early church. The evidence is fairly clear that there were, and it's something people were disagreeing about relatively early on in church history. But I think the arguments about, we found a baptismal pool, in ancient Ephesus that, shows they were clearly dunking adults and stuff like that, I find all that just quite moot. For me, it was never about, archaeological, very early evidence. But most Christians throughout history and most of the great thinkers of church history, people like St. Augustine and whatnot, were Peter Baptists. Now, that in itself isn't conclusive evidence. You could
sometimes the minority report is right. And
exactly. Yeah, you could have a lot of very smart people who are wrong. You could have a faithful remnant of Baptists. But it should make you wisely just sit up and take notice. Because if you are always setting yourself against the majority report in church history, you end up just being rather like Rehoboam, who surrounds himself with, dismisses the older counselors and surrounds himself with the younger ones, and says, "Oh, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins." So it just makes you sit up and take notice. Now, I've heard Baptists say that whenever they hear someone saying how they went from being a Baptist to being a Peter Baptist, they never say, "Oh, one day I was just reading my Bible and Peter baptism just leapt out at me," which for them is a bit of a kind of a point to say, well, it's just not biblical. It comes from sort of outside ideas and the framework imposed on the text. But that simple thing of, well, a lot of other people who've read the Bible really well and are very godly and cleverer than I am seem to have come to this position. So I began to give it a bit more weight, the Peter Baptist position, but remains fairly convinced Baptist for several years throughout most of my 20s. Then lockdown happened, and I had a lot of spare time early on in lockdown. I was working in a school, and so I wasn't in work, working from home, so I had a lot of time in the garden listening to a lot of lectures and podcasts on Lutheran theology, because my time at Bible College studying the Lord's Supper, I actually came to a more historic, we'd say, reformed view of the Lord's Supper before I became a Peter Baptist. So I grew up in a Baptistic church, and the Lord's Supper is just a symbol, just a memorial, designed to remind us of Jesus' death, but nothing else. But through my studies, began to kind of conclude, actually, there is, in a way, Jesus is present in the supper, not in the way Roman Catholics think, but in a way that reformers like John Calvin and Thomas Cranmer would think. But Lutheranism is a sort of different take on those sorts of things. And I was just very interested in what the Lutherans actually think, because you don't really meet Lutherans in the UK. And the Lutherans have they're Peter Baptists, and they have a view of baptismal regeneration, we'd say.
So just just for the sake of the non-nerdy historical listeners. Just what do you mean by baptismal regeneration?
Yeah, I was going to stop there.
I'm sorry.
I'm worried I'm getting into sort of nerdy positions. So, when you go to a Roman Catholic baptism, if everyone's ever been to one, or a Roman Catholic christening, which I did with my Irish family, they literally say things like, your original sin has been washed away, you are now a Christian, stuff like that, which I just always recoiled against massively. And that idea that you're being baptized makes you a Christian, and if you're a Roman Catholic, you just then do penance and keep your spiritual debts short. I always recoiled against that. But then you find that actually within Protestantism, there are kinds of baptismal regeneration that people believe. So Martin Luther did believe that when you baptize somebody, something happened, as did actually a lot of Anglican reformers, people who drew up the 39 Articles and the basis of the faith of the Church of England. So began to see, there's this other position within the Protestant tradition that isn't the kind of just a symbol view I grew up with, and it isn't the full-blown this totally makes you a Christian kind of Roman Catholic view. So I began to really listen to the Lutheran view on things. And the thing the Lutherans will really say about their own position is they take what we often find as these awkward verses in the New Testament about what baptism does very seriously and basically try and take them at face value. So Titus 3, this is the washing of regeneration. 1 Peter 3, the waters of the flood symbolize this water of baptism, which now saves you. What does that mean? Now, everyone's got an answer to what that means. Baptists included have to find a way to explain those verses. But the Lutheran view that baptism saves, that it regenerates, that they are put that differently to how the Roman Catholics do, kind of pushed me to a far end. That these verses they're hard to deal with. They're saying something really strong. That like baptism now saves you. This is the washing of regeneration. Wow. And I think, in short, I got to the point where I got all the way to the end of the Lutheran position, looking at the Roman Catholic position that the baptism does something. It's like, I can't quite go there.
Yeah.
But it seems evident enough to me that there's a strong enough view of baptism here and what it does to make baptizing your children actually much more intelligible to me than it ever had been.
Yeah.
Because the Baptist position as well, you're not believing, so we won't baptize you yet. We won't symbolize outwardly something we don't think has happened inwardly. But the New Testament speaks of baptism in such strong terms, I began to feel that sort of fall away.
So just to try and join those two things together, the Lord's Supper and baptism, I think it's really interesting that you had the experience of finding one of those more deep, understanding that more deeply, and then thinking, hang on a second. Because you know how in 1 Corinthians it talks about how we can't eat at the table of the Lord and the table of demons, or drink the cup of demons. And there's this clear idea in that passage that if you're participating in idol sacrifices and worship, then you are actually dealing with demons, and there's like a spiritual connection with demons that obviously Paul's saying, don't get involved with demons. It's kind of like with the Lord's Supper, he's saying, in the same way, except positively and wonderfully, we are spiritually involved with the Lord when we are receiving the Lord's Supper. Perhaps that analogy kind of, when you run that back through into baptism, I don't think any of us would have any problem with saying that somebody who takes part in a satanic initiation ritual is actually getting involved spiritually with Satan in a way that is like new and effective and very serious. And I suppose the flip side of that is, well, why would we not think that about getting involved with, a Christian initiation ritual is in some way, and I'm with you, I'm not saying in the same kind of automatic way that is what the Roman Catholic and the Lutheran position sort of boil down to in a way, but in some, why would we think that you can get initiated into demons but not into God?
Yeah, totally. It was that language in 1 Corinthians 11, the latter part of that, where Paul is talking about the supper and doing so kind of to contrast it with participation in demon worship, this language of communing with Christ. And the Baptist kind of interpretation of that passage is that when he talks about discerning the body, he means kind of the body that is the church. But I don't think, like you were saying, that makes sense of the talk of spiritual communion. If you go and join a demon feast, you are literally communing with demons. Well, if you come and feast with the Lord, you're literally communing with the Lord, and with his body and blood in particular. Now that's we're not talking about the Lord's Supper. So what does it mean that we commune with the body and blood of Jesus, but we're not Roman Catholics who think that we're actually literally eating the body and blood of Jesus Christ, that's a different question. But
Yeah.
again, there's just this very strong language, and I became very unconvinced of the Baptist attempts to explain that away. And then other things are, often the debates I would have had, say 10 years ago, another student, were all about sort of the kind of household baptisms in Acts, and the logic of the household. Everyone in the household is baptized. Well, that obviously means children. Oh yeah, but feasibly maybe it doesn't.
Yeah.
So I kind of found that moot, but it was as this sense of the strong spiritual terms in which the New Testament talks about baptism began to make sense, and then the other stuff kind of fell into place for me. So I think I've probably come at it from a different direction from some people. I think a lot of people come via the kind of household theology route, whereas I came at it more from the kind of what we say the sacramental angle, with the way the New Testament speaks about baptism. So back to my mention of Baptists like to say no one ever says they were just reading their Bible and they became a Peter Baptist. Well, when I realised that a lot of very wise people are Peter Baptists, that just alerted me actually to the way that they read their Bible. So it is from reading the Bible with more of an open ear and kind of meditating on what it actually says that I came to be a Peter Baptist.
That is really interesting because I guess how I'd sort of expected that you would come, as I have largely come from the kind of promises covenant route, which is what the household route really is, and say, well, the children are included in the promises, and I mean, look at the Bible, look at both Old and New Testament, as I was talking about with Peter last time. If they're included in the promises, then why would they not be included in the sign of those promises? But you're saying it is the sort of seriousness, the effectiveness of baptism that makes you. Can you just help us to join the dots between that and the children as recipients of it? Because I can imagine a kind of high church Baptist understanding, if you like, where people are saying, yeah, that's why it's such an important and effective sign that we can only give it to those who have professed faith.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and to be clear, I do find now the household argument's very strong, and it probably also a returning to 1 Corinthians 7, which talks about the what is 1 Corinthians 7? The household becoming those who are in the household being holy.
The
believing.
I think that's in chapter 7.
I
guess your point about the household thing, though, I think, is that if you're just sort of grubbing around in that particular verse and trying to make a claim that, well, there must have been influence in that household, and it opens up all kinds of. If you're trying to pin it on one verse or a series of verses, that is sort of unconvincing. Whereas seeing that household promises covenant picture against the backdrop of the whole scriptural teaching about it, that the household thing fits into that rather than the household thing proving that, if you know what I mean. Is that?
Yes. Yeah, and so I think if we take those things about what baptism is said to do seriously, baptism saves, whatever that means. Baptism is the washing of regeneration. Then that makes sense to me of how you can speak in 1 Corinthians 7 of the household or the children of believers being holy, in whatever sense, because they have been through the washing of regeneration and they have been saved through baptism. Again, whatever that means. I'm not a baptismal regenerationist, so I don't think that because your child has been under the water, that means they are inwardly saved in such a way that they will never fall away, and that they're elect. But I think that they are saved in a sense because they are taken out of the world, in the same way that anyone who went through the Red Sea is saved, because they are taken out of Egypt. Does it mean they're all elect? Certainly not. So it involves an admission that the Bible will use the same word in slightly different ways. It's speaking about different realities. But I think we acknowledge that just in generally how we speak about things. And also we acknowledge that in a lot of other ways that the Bible speaks about things. That, well, when it uses that word here, it sort of means this. One would, I'll stop there. But that was part of it.
Yeah. So just sort of help us to tease out there. You wanting to say you came to the strong conviction from reading the New Testament that baptism does something. It's not a kind of mere graduation ceremony and flourish. Well, maybe that's not the right metaphor. Why does that mean that children are valid recipients of it?
Well, this is where I think the household. Well, I'll start further back as well. And a big sea change for me was the question of infant faith. Now, I don't know many Baptists who would say that an infant can't have faith, but I know a lot who will go very hard on the ambiguities of whether they can.
Yeah.
And yet that for me seems very easily refutable from the pages of Scripture, that the Psalms will speak about being taught wisdom at your mother's breast,
Yeah.
and John the Baptist in the womb leaps at the presence of Christ in Mary's womb. So infants can have faith, and that seems very evident to me. Now, most Baptists would then say yes, but we can't be sure, so we give it to an age of consent. And Anglicans do a similar thing with confirmation, that we want there to be a point where they sort of publicly acknowledge their faith and own it for themselves. So if we're accepting infants can have faith, then I think you put on the question of households at that point, that God deals with households from the beginning of the Scripture to the end. It's a category that he acknowledges, and that includes children. And therefore, if promises are given to households, and households and baptism is a kind of sign and seal of the promise, then it can be applied to the children.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So a couple of episodes back, where I was just talking through this article that B.B. Warfield wrote about the history of the doctrine of infant salvation, and pointing out how in the early centuries of the church, because they had this really strong idea of baptismal regeneration, in other words, the sign and the thing signified are like properly rammed together so that you truly can't be made clean from your sin unless you have received baptism. That caused a massive problem for them. Well, a logical problem for them as they thought about infants who died, because unless they'd been baptized, they couldn't possibly be regenerate. So they had to, find a sort of non-harsh segment of hell for them. And the kind of great discovery, I think, of the reformers was, and I have to say, this is more the like Swiss Reformation side of it than the Lutheran side, in my limited understanding of it, was this idea that no, that it's not that they're baptized so that they are saved and those two things are rammed together. They're baptized because they are holy, as it says in 1 Corinthians, because they're within a family of faith. I guess for me, the analogy that's always kind of helped me to understand that is, if you think about a tiny baby or even an unborn baby and say, what is their native language? Like, my wife's pregnant at the moment, so we're a couple of months out. What is that child's native language? The sort of, how do you answer that? But the answer is obviously English. That child is going to, in two years' time, start to make sounds that are English rather than Chinese or anything else. And actually, it's what's quite striking is, maybe I'm about to push this analogy too far, is that, actually children who don't hear a native speaker of that language in the very early stage, before they can actually understand it for themselves or speak it for themselves, they're learning to be able to accurately reproduce those sounds at an incredibly early age. And I suppose I'm just using that as a kind of analogy for what you call infant faith, but it's also part of just the like covenant family household idea, which is the children who are born into a household where there is faith with one or both parents, their native language, so to speak, is faith and Jesus. And again, like you could choose never to speak English again if you wanted to and learn Chinese. Sorry, I could play that the other way around. I'm not trying to say anything about Chinese in particular, you know what I mean? But kind of for me, that helps to draw together the faith of the infant side and the promises side, or the covenant side.
Yeah, and I think as well, I was perhaps not too clear in my answer to your previous question, why is it appropriate that children are given the sign? I think a big shift for me was understanding the visible nature of the church, and that God's visible entry into history in the creation of the church is an important big thing, and it's part of his work, and it's not just his invisible work in the hearts of the elect that matters, and that it is significant for the children of believers to be in believing households and in the church, even if they themselves are not elected and not saved, there is a sense in which they are saved and set apart from the world because they are put into a Christian family. I think that we are so, as evangelicals, so set upon the individual regeneration. That's where we want people to get to. We want to get people over the line and into conversion, that we lose sight of the fact that God's visible activity in the world is something he's doing. It's one of his ministries. The same way that he is electing and saving individuals invisibly, his visible work in the world is still important, even if it's a work of judgment. That's the thing.
Yeah.
The visible presence of the church in the world to the unbelievers without, and even to the unbelievers within, that is something that God's doing, and that is one of his means to serve his invisible work.
And it's obviously, a mystery to us when we read the stuff that Jesus says about in John 15 about the vine and the branches and the ones that are cut off because they don't bear fruit, but they were, they had to remain in the vine, and the fact that they didn't is the reason why they didn't bear fruit, but it's also the reason why they're cut off. But this idea that, that there are branches in the visible church corresponding, I guess, to people, which will be cut off, but that doesn't mean that right now they're not in the visible church, and that they might bear fruit. Actually, from our perspective, here and now, what Jesus is calling us to do in that chapter is remain in the vine. Hang on, branches don't have autonomy to remain in the vine. Jesus knew that, but he's telling us both at the same time, which is, people, of course, apostasy is real and people leave the faith, and but nevertheless, okay, fine. Jesus is saying, well, remain in the vine. Then we don't do that. And I suppose that helps us. Often one of the Baptist objections to infant baptism, and to be fair, this is made a lot worse by the massive denominations where everyone gets baptized as a kid, but nobody believes it as an adult. Church of England is one of those, but Roman Catholics, Orthodox too. One of the objections would just be, well, look, you're baptizing people who are plainly not Christians, and they're turning away from it. What's your kind of answer to that objection?
I think that, well, again, if they are infants, there's no sense in which they're plainly unbelievers. If we accept that infant faith is a thing, and really all faith is infant faith, I think is a good way to think about it, that we are all infants who simply receive. So it's not that they're plainly unbelievers. It's different to baptizing an adult who's plainly an unbeliever. More vexed question of baptizing the children of plainly unbelieving parents, which I know there will be varying answers to throughout the tradition, and I'm sure actually even among Orthodox Anglicans and Evangelical Anglicans. So that's more of a moot point. But it's again, to take an Old Testament example, is like saying, well, why would you circumcise somebody who may go on to worship Baal? Or why take somebody through the Red Sea if they're going to grumble on the other side? Or hey, they've already been grumbling before they even got through the Red Sea.
Yeah.
They are marked out and are part of a visible community, a visible thing that God is doing in history. And that's how he's ordained it. That's how he's designed this to work. I think there is a visible, invisible sort of progression to some extent from the Old Testament to the New, certainly, but God is still working visibly. And so to be in the body of the church, to be in the world, even if you are someone who walks away from it, it's still to be part of something that God's doing, and it's actually always going to stay with you. And this is and this is why historically Peter Baptists will not rebaptize somebody who comes back to the faith, because they were actually set apart in the visible church a long time ago, irrespective of what's happened, even if they were baptized sometimes in another denomination. Am I correct in saying an Anglican will recognize a Roman Catholic infant baptism if someone?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I thought that was good. And I think this is something that the Roman Catholic approach to things does sort of get right in saying, no, you were dunked and that was your original sin was absolved, and now you've just got to sort of clear off your other sins by confession and penance as and when they arise. You were really marked out. Something really did happen. Even if you were baptized and you don't remember it, and your parents are dead, and it was just them and a priest who were there at your baptism, does that still matter? was it still a thing? Is it still effective in some way? And I think yes, because God did it. And baptism is a sign outwardly to others, to the church, to the world, it's a sign to us, but it's a sign to God. And that's the same with one of the Old Testament signs. What's the rainbow? It's a sign to God of his own promises. Um,
Yeah.
Circumcision, likewise, yes, it's a sign to everybody else. It's a sign in your own body that you carry around with you, but it's a sign to God of the covenant He made with Abraham to remind God, quotation marks, of what He's promised. I think baptism is a similar thing. It's a sign that you carry around with you, testifying continually to God of what He has promised, even if that promise is something that doesn't come about, for decades when you actually kind of are born again and come to the faith.
Yeah.
And I think baptism is a lot more of a kind of ritual juju than we are comfortable with thinking. You've talked about ancient pagan meals that you could join in and initiation rites, and but we don't really have those in the modern world. We're born and you grow up and your parents say, "Hey, we just want you to be happy, make your own decisions." But actually, baptism is a sort of mystical initiation rite that in some ways is much
Yeah.
more similar to kind of weird stuff that the pagans do than it is to anything that we do in the modern world, because that is how entry into any community is generally marked throughout history and throughout the world with some kind
Yeah.
of rite.
And I think the story of the prodigal son is just such a, isn't it just a wonderful story? But like the way, particularly in connection with this people who come to faith later in life thing, was the prodigal son a son before he came back? I mean, in some ways, like the way that he behaves in the story prior to his coming to his senses and coming back is very unson-like. I mean, he literally just wants his father dead and wants to get out of there. And even when he comes back, his confession is, "I'm not worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." In a sense, like he is still failing to acknowledge his sonship, even in a sense, rightly failing to acknowledge his sonship at that point. But he's still a son, and you want to say to people who were baptized as a child, marked as a member of God's people, when they then come back and for them it feels like, "I was never one of God's people before. I'm not worthy to be called your son. Maybe like one of your hired servants." And it's like, no, you're my son all along. And now, if it were possible to be my son, you're yet more my son. But going through those moments of conversion, that is what's going on with the prodigal son. But he was a prodigal son before, while he was still prodigal,
And I think Baptists really ultimately run into the problem that they accuse the Peter Baptists of running into when it comes to baptizing unbelievers. If you have someone who's an upstanding member of a Baptist church, who's baptized, and then has some massive moral failing, apostatizes, runs away, comes back years later and repents, but says, "Actually, I don't think I was even a Christian. I don't think I was born again back then. I need to be rebaptized." Well, what position does that put the elders of that church in? Are they then going to say, "Actually, no, we think you were a Christian, and so we're not going to rebaptize you"? Well, that just kind of pits your word against theirs. And like, I've seen this with even say with people I know, their understanding of when they even became a Christian shifts massively, over time. And if you, I think, subject yourself to that very subjective measure, then you're just going to end up, constantly rebaptizing people. In practice, they don't, because they know it's ridiculous. Which is a whole other thing of what Baptists do in practice and how much it actually lines up with what they think. But I don't think Baptists escape that problem of what you do with someone who that doesn't live out their baptism.
Yeah, and then comes back to it. Yeah, interesting. So tell me, so you said just before we started recording that it was about 20. Well, in fact, you said it as well while we've been chatting. That it was 2020, the lockdown time. Does that coincide with your becoming a parent, and has that had any impact on your? Has that caused you to reflect on the scriptures in a different way, having children of your own now? Is that part of it for you?
Yeah, certainly. So we have 3 children. Our eldest was born in 2018. We got pregnant with our second, literally just as lockdown was beginning, and then our third is 8 months old now. So yeah, certainly, you become a parent, your whole mindset changes. You do begin to look anew at what Scripture says about families and how it talks about families. So yeah, I was already coming at it, as I've said at the start, from the kind of sacramental angle of the way that the Bible talks about baptism, and then having children of my own, and as they begin to reach an age where you really are parenting them more actively, especially as a dad, you're kind of useless for a lot of the initial stages of a child's life. You begin to think, what Scripture says about parenting, and probably another shift I underwent is that I found a Baptist account of parenting just thoroughly inconsistent. Now, on one level, that doesn't bother me because I look around and I'm like, well, all these Baptists pretty much treat their kids like they're Christians, as if they were Peter Baptists. So,
yeah, and we're all going to be saved through, looking back. We'll think we were saved through complete errors and inconsistencies, and that's as much true of me as people I can actually see it, and I just can't see it in myself. But I totally know what you mean.
Yeah, I think there is doublethink. I think because, but I think it's true of evangelicals generally. And I guess charge I'd make against the many Peter Baptists who I did know before I became a Peter Baptist myself would be that they're not Peter Baptist enough, and don't always kind of live out and talk out their convictions, because as evangelicals, like we said, we're so interested in individual inner conversion that I think we can sort of parent our kids as if they are Christians, but we're so worried about whether they really are Christians that we treat them as if they are and they aren't, in quite an anxiety-inducing way, I think.
Yeah. Whereas John 15 is telling us exactly what to do with that. I mean, what we're saying to ourselves and to any other person who's been baptized is remain in the vine. Apart from me, you could do nothing. You're only going to bear fruit by remaining in the vine, but so remain in the vine. And I don't know if that's anxiety inducing. It certainly doesn't sort of satisfy all of my logical, what does that mean about who fits in where? But that's just plainly what it says. And that's the way that Jesus instructs his disciples about it. And yeah, interesting. I can see what you mean. And one of the things I often feel about my baptism in my own parenting is I don't make much of it with my own children. I don't think I would often say to them, like Luther often talks about how, in his kind of characteristically florid way, he talks about how he'd be assailed by the temptations of the devil appearing in his study, and he'd throw an ink pot at them and say, you have no claim over me because I'm baptized. But there isn't. That is exactly what baptism signifies. The flesh and the world of sin, has no claim over me. I've died to that. And precisely our sort of symbolism for that, our shorthand for that is, I am baptized. You, my child, have been baptized. Live like it. I don't think I make much of that in my own parenting either.
Yeah, certainly. That feels like a sort of traditional way of speaking that's been lost. So I think more among the Presbyterians that I know who are in the minority, we don't have many of them on the mainland here in the UK, or certainly in England. I think it lives more, but I think among evangelical Anglicans, the likes of which St Leonard's is very representative of, that has died away. So I would love to see a revival of that. And I should clarify, as we probably draw towards the end, that I'm having to sort of put my money where my mouth is. I'm in a Baptistic church. I'm grateful to have elders who, like I've said, are very generous around the question of baptism and are happy to kind of give me leave to go and get our kids baptized, which we have yet to do, but I'm in the process of organising, because we have to travel in order to get it done. Well, we have a local parish, but I do not want the vicar there going anywhere near my children. And I let it. It's a sea change that I made, and it was significant enough that I let it sit with me theoretically for a couple of years before, in practice, making the decision that no, I'm convinced of this and want to go and actually do it and let that be part of our household. And I've made what is probably wise decision of telling my children that is something we're doing, so they keep reminding me of it whenever we read something in the Bible.
So that's good. That's so we can all see what the application of this podcast is to Rhys and his family. But I think you're right. It is a big shift in mindset, and maybe the other people listening are thinking, I'm still pondering this. And I can start to see some of the biblical pictures of it coming into focus, but they're not quite in focus yet. Well, yeah, right. Like let them come into focus and then act as your convictions lead you. But I mean, just to sort of finish off with my own testimony about baptism and the children, baptism truly is a means of grace that is for the children, but also for the parents, and that we are able to cling not to our own efforts. And Christian parenting is by faith and not by technique, and it is a product of God's grace and not really my efforts, except insofar as they're given to me by His grace. And to be able to look at baptism and say that was the mark that God put on them, which I really had nothing to do with. That's the kind of thing that parents need to cling to, and it's a sort of visible, memorable reminder of, that is what God is doing in our life. He's put these children in our family, and okay, that means He's put them in a family of sinners and limited, faltering people. But He's also put them in a family where grace is broken in, and here's the proof of it, if you like. Great. Well, Rhys, thank you so much. It's been a real joy to talk about one of my favourite things with you, and to kind of hear how you've been pondering that over the years. And thanks for your kind of humility about how it's taken you a while to get there. Just remind us again, so your Davenant Institute, I haven't actually taken any Davenant courses myself, but I've many, many times been tempted, and perhaps there are people listening who are just thinking, do you know what, I could definitely dip into that. And there's like all kinds of, it's not just reading Latin medieval theology, is it? There's stuff on Tolkien and all kinds of other interesting things out there as well. And remind us again, your Substack is called?
The New Albion. So if you just Google Rhys Laverty, The New Albion, you'll find it. Or if you go to thenewalbion.substack.com, you'll find it.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Rhys, for joining us. Great to chat.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be with you.